Jesus will get us in trouble every time, yes? Is this one particularly challenging? Yeah. Okay, so if it helps soothe us at all, apparently, for nearly 2,000 years, biblical scholars have wrestled to make sense out of what Jesus is saying to us. In fact, the commentaries that I was reading this week say, we aren't sure what Jesus meant. Or, we're not sure we like what we think Jesus meant. Either way, Matthew is making us uncomfortable. And Matthew apparently took other Gospels' versions and added a little twist, just to make it that much more uncomfortable. Some commentators have read a fairly anti-Semitic line into this. Well, the first guests who are invited are the Jews, and they're the ones who are the murderers. You get that one, right? And then the Christians are the good guests who show up later. Yeah, that's us. Except anytime you hear an anti-Semitic greeting, you need to check yourself because, of course, Jesus was a Jew, born, raised, executed, lived, died, raised again as a Jew. The gospel writers were Jews. Most of our ancestors were Jews. The first Christians were Jews. So if we're reading an anti-Semitic reading into it, we need to check ourselves. Because apparently when the second invitation goes out, the good and the bad are all invited. So if you think we're the good ones, we should probably check ourselves again. It's hard to know which is which some days, isn't it? Am I the good one or am I the bad one? I always want to think I'm the good one. If I'm always on the inside, if I'm always the good one, I definitely need to check myself. If I'm always in the right, whoo, golly, check myself. This is a tough parable because even after guests are invited and fill the hall, apparently some of us show up without the right wedding attire. I am wearing a stole today, but not the robe. And if you're concerned about that, y'all aren't wearing robes either. And if you show up not wearing the right thing, then you're thrown into the outer darkness with weeping and gnashing of teeth. So if this is allegory, it gets really confusing, not just for us reading it today, but for the commentators and biblical scholars across centuries. Because it gets messy and we aren't sure who's who and what's what. What is the wedding robe? I mean, are we actually talking about clothing? I'm looking around to see if I see any ties this morning. Anyone wearing a tie? Mick is wearing a tie. Yay, Mick. Tie and suit jacket. Good job. Unless that isn't the wedding attire. When I started in Shawano, there was one particular woman who shall remain nameless, although you all know who I'm talking about, who commented on the fact that I wore slacks to church. And I'd been there about 3 months when she wore slacks the first time. Apparently, women can worship God wearing slacks. Did you know that? Isn't that amazing? It's kind of cool, isn't it? Apparently, dresses for women aren't required as wedding attire. What in the world are we talking about if this is allegorical? Some people want it to be baptism, but that doesn't hold with some of other Jesus stories. One of the ones that I find more compelling is that it's the life we live. We're invited into one sort of celebration, but if we don't choose to live the life to which we're invited, then we suffer. But honestly, I can't prove that that's what Jesus was talking about. And fortunately, neither can 2,000 years of biblical scholars. So I feel like I'm in okay company, not knowing exactly what Jesus was talking about. The other thing that I think is significant about this particular story told by Matthew, and keep in mind that the Gospel of Matthew was not written at the time that Jesus lived. It was written decades after his death, and may well have been written near the time, or just soon after the time, that the city of Jerusalem itself was destroyed by the Romans. The city of Jerusalem was burned. In fact, there's a museum in the old city called the Burnt House Museum, where you can go climb down the stairs to the remains of a first-century house that was burned out. When you live in the midst of empire, when you are the minority, when you live in the midst of occupation, which is violent and destructive, the choices may seem stark. And so maybe Matthew is speaking into the starkness of trying to live the faithful way in the midst of significant conflict. And if we need some reassurance, and I don't know about you, but I could use some, the news of the world these days put me in a place where I could really use some reassurance. How about you? Yeah? In the midst of fires and hurricanes and shootings and bombings and one horror story after another, my heart and soul could use some reassurance that all shall be well, that all manner of things shall be well. So we have this story out of Exodus. One of the other bad habits that Christians have is contrasting the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament. And what do we say about the God of the Old Testament? Say it again. No. When we're contrasting them, what do we say? Fire and brimstone. God of the Old Testament is full of wrath, right? We actually have the word wrath in Exodus, as opposed to the God of the New Testament, which is love, grace, light. Yes? Okay, if you need any reassurance that that is not an accurate reading, I give you this week's readings. We have outer darkness and gnashing of teeth in the New Testament. And even though there is a threat of wrath out of Exodus, and I dearly love this story, Moses sits down with God and says, God, come on. Yeah, they made a golden calf. Yeah, they said that it delivered them from slavery in Egypt, but come on, God. You're there, God. You're the one who delivered them. You're the one who promised them land. You're the one who promised them blessings like the stars and the sand on the shore for generations to come. Come on, God. And what happens? God changes God's mind. I love this. I love the idea that Moses has a debate with God, and God changes God's mind. And preserves the people. Good and bad, all of us together, for generations to come. I don't find it soothing to hear people promise that the reward of faith is blessings, because I know it isn't true. I know deeply faithful people who have suffered, who have anguished over loss of health, loved ones, their churches, their communities, their environment. I know that there is not a quid pro quo with God that you be faithful and good things happen. I know, in fact, that faithful people suffer and bad things happen to good people. And frankly, fabulous things happen to some really rotten people, right? But I do find it soothing to my soul that God changes God's mind even when we break covenant, and invites everyone, good and bad, into the wedding feast. And our task as people of faith, I hope, is to live with gratitude, that we might offer soothing presence for other souls who suffer. Our task of faith is to live with gratitude for the sake of God and all God's creation, and that may soothe all our souls. Amen.